So the packet that I'm sending around is these are class notes that were given to me by Mark Allen Powell, who I talk about a lot. He was the New Testament professor at Trinity when I went to seminary.
I didn't get.
Yeah, they're coming. Yep, they're coming.
Oh.
And any extras you can just put in the middle, and we'll keep them here for someone else.
Okay.
I am not going to cover this whole packet. These are class notes from Intro to New Testament. He designs the handouts for that class for future pastors, should they become ordained after his time in seminary, to use in congregation. So that's what I'm doing. I've brought the handouts that we learned from in class that he always said, these are for you to use when you get to your congregation. The first page has some background on some of the groups that you hear in the New Testament. And I am talking about Qoheleth and Ecclesiastes, but I'm showing you the groups that are the background to the New Testament. So this is a lot of sort of academic stuff to stick with. If you have questions, write them down. I'm going to do this 2 weeks in a row. The only one that I'm going to talk about is the first one, but I'm giving the first paragraph, but I'm giving you all this information because maybe you're having trouble sleeping and you just want to, tuck in at night with some good notes on what animism is. And so whatever, I'll talk about that in a minute. So the first one is about the Pharisees. Have you ever thought about where the Pharisees came from? So by the time Jesus is walking around, we know in the gospel lessons, the Pharisees are the code for the foil, the bad guys. They're code for the troublemakers, right? When Jesus heals people or does stuff in all the New Testament, it's often the scribes and the Pharisees that are like, don't do that, or who get mad at him. In the story, they're sort of they're not terribly evil, but they're sort of the foils sometimes for what Jesus is doing. Where'd they come from? Who are these people? So this handout is about some of the real quick background on where these people come from, and this has direct bearing on Qoheleth. I'm going to propose to you, and it's often proposed, that Qoheleth is a fake scribe. He's trying to pretend like he's a scribe. The Pharisees and the scribes are the same group. Scribes are like a subset of the Pharisees, and they're the ones who they're basically lawyers. But I'm going to go over this quickly. The Pharisees is talking about being middle class. An important one here, the second bullet point, is that their power base is outside of Jerusalem. So if you think about what happened to the Jewish people, especially by the time of Jesus, they are no longer Jerusalem-centric people. They've gotten into exile, they've gotten into temples that are spread out. This word is going to appear on some of these other pieces of paper, but I'm going to use a word called the diaspora, which is a word that we often apply to Jewish folks, but can also be Lutherans. Diaspora are people that that get spread all out. So the Pharisees are really kind of come about because of the synagogue system. Remember that Jesus can travel around to all those places, and he can enter a synagogue in his travels. And lo and behold, who's in there? The scribes and the Pharisees who say, it's a Sabbath, you're not supposed to be helping that guy. They're sort of the synagogue system people. So that's the third one, associated with synagogues. Teachers and scholars. And then it says often called scribes. And then they are eventually the system that rabbis come from. Pastors are sort of modeled around this same idea. That I'm not in Germany as a Lutheran. I'm all the way over here in America, but I'm ordained as part of the Lutheran Church. So we're sort of spread out all over the place. Here's a big one. It's the 5th bullet point down. Theologically committed to maintaining Israel's relationship with God through obedience to the law. Why don't the scribes and Pharisees like Jesus?
Because he didn't ascribe to the law all the time.
Because
thing.
he did not ascribe to the law as they
They-
thought he should.
Yes.
Right. Sorry.
It's an
I rephrased
important.
that wrong.
Now he had to constantly. He would always, not always. He would often rejoinder their comments. So he would heal a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, and they would say, "Oh, you're breaking all the Sabbath rules," and he would say, "What's better, a healed hand or a Sabbath rule?" Right. So they were at risk of being so worried about wisdom and the rules and the law that they no longer cared about the source of it. Does that make sense? I can say that a couple different ways. I would say that any church person is at risk of this. Any pastor, so I'm not just looking at you, I'm not just speaking to any person of faith is at risk of being so sure that they know how it works that they aren't able to see how it works. The Pharisees are in the Bible because they often say the thing we would say. They often say the thing that I would hear churches say. Like I've done this one in this Bible study before, and I do it to be evocative and troublemaking. If I was to say, I'm not going to be able to lead worship this morning because I'm going to be camped out in my office with a known prostitute who's come to see me because she's really, or he's really got something going on and is in real danger, so I'm going to go meet with him. People, St. Stephen would be like, we pay you to be out here. We pay you to not be bunkered in your room with people of questionable background. I would get in all sorts of trouble from that. The Pharisees were more interested in it becomes possible to be a scribe where you write down wisdom and religion and faith so many times that you're more interested in the calligraphy of the thing you're writing than the point of it. Does that make sense? And you've all seen people like that. I'm just going to look at the ceiling or look at myself. I've been a person like that. This is not a finger pointing at other people. I'm just saying that this happens, right? The other important thing, and this hints at it in the next bullet point, which I think is 6, accepted as scripture most of what Christians would call the Old Testament. The important thing here is, at the time of Qoheleth, and this one's going out on a limb because I'm not 100% sure of what I'm about to say. I'm more than 50% sure that the canon of the Old Testament was not locked in then. It was not locked in when Qoheleth was written, so they did not know what books were going to be in the Bible. It was locked in later. Meaning people could still be writing them. And that's a thing Qoheleth plays around with. Qoheleth was one of the last books to get into the canon, into the group of the big, and there was people will still to this day say it shouldn't be in there because it does not mention God much, if at all. So this is in the coming moments. I'm going to tell you that Qoheleth is posing as a scribe. Posing as a scribe. Why would you pose as a scribe? Because it's way easier to be disparaging of something that you're one of. And I'm going to talk about what I'm talking about with that. So I'm going to quickly race down through this. You get the piece of paper. And I'm going to talk about this again next week in a different way because it's a lot of information. It has the other groups. There was not just the scribes and the Pharisees. The scribes and the Pharisees had other groups besides Jesus that they did not always get along with. There's the Sadducees. You go on to the back. The Essenes were a group that removed out of the present and sort of lived out on their own. The Herodians and the Zealots, and there's some background on who they are. These are all things you'll see in the New Testament. The next page has philosophy and religion in the Roman world. I'm not going to read all this to you. I'm giving you the paper. My point here is to say as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to keep your identity. As the Jewish people became diaspora, as they spread out, as synagogues were all over the place, it's harder and harder to maintain who you are and who God has said you are. All these things are competing for their attention and for their... I've made the argument before, and I made this even with Qoheleth, that the word paradise did not enter the Jewish lexicon until they met people who had a different faith background, and they started to say, okay, we're going to adapt some of that. Think of where we live in America. We are what I would call pluralists, which is what these people are having trouble with. Pluralists see, think about how, I'll do it with food. I'll talk about with food. Who likes Mexican, or who likes sushi, or who likes Italian, or who... We can have any of that and anything else at almost any given time at this point. But if you grew up in a certain family that ate a certain thing, you might be fine with trying other stuff, but it's not what grandma used to make. The scribes wanted to keep everything in a world that's pluralistic. What they wanted to keep everything the good old ways. Anybody do that now? Anybody
Passover,
always keep...
Passover does that.
Yeah. Anybody do that in our world? Hey, we have so much going on. We just need to stick to these same... They were so resistant to everything that scared them that they were closed on anything new or different. So what I'm giving you here is all this list. So all this list of all the things and all the ideas that are competing for people's attention. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I can sit with people who are beloved children of God and who are Lutherans, and they will tell me things, and I will hear them, and I'll be thinking to myself, that's New Age. That's not what Lutherans believe. I don't really argue with them per se. I try to maybe steer a little bit. Or I'll hear people say things all the time that I'm like, well, that's not the same as... So do I behave like a scribe? Do I look at you and say, you are not Lutheran, you are in a lot of trouble? How do we process that we have all these different things in our heads? I don't do the sort of, you have to do this, because I don't pretend to be, I'm not a cradle Lutheran, I don't pretend to know everything, but you can hear people say things and even say them about how God works and be like, ugh. And your choice is, do I say, or do I try to work, the scribes were, you cannot say that, that's not the way we say it. They're lawyers. They're worried about the detail of how you do it and how you say it, to the point that when Jesus sits in their midst, they do not like that he is different, and they're not able to see it. How do you talk to a person who will not change their mind?
It's pretty hard. Sometimes you just ignore them. Yeah.
By the time the New Testament rolls around, we get stories like this. This is from the 2nd chapter of Mark. You don't have to follow me. I'm just going to read it. It's from Mark. This is also, I read this also tomorrow in the Preparing for Sunday that came out this morning. So if you want to hear more talk about this, you could look there. I read these same verses for that. 2nd chapter of Mark. And as Jesus sat at dinner in Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were also sitting with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the scribes of the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard this, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." We're talking about people who could very well be us sometimes, who can't see the forest for the trees. And I can break out all the other cliches. How do the scribes know that what they're doing is bad? How do you ever tell them? How do you convince them? If they have Jesus right in front of them and can't see it, how do you do it? Right? This problem becomes all the way down to the world we live in. When you talk to somebody who will literally say, I'm kind of exaggerating, but you can think of experiences you have that are similar to this. I appreciate that you go to church, but I basically already know what they tell me there, and I do not believe that. I basically already know who Jesus is. I basically already know what the church is going to tell me, and I'm choosing not to be a part of that. How do you change somebody's mind?
You can't.
I like that, and I'm going to put a note in that, but I want to hear what Thel has to say, and then I'll talk about that.
I ran into a situation this morning. 2 people on my transportation coming from 2 miles away to here. So, pull in the church parking lot. Is this your church? Are you going to church?
Mm-hmm.
And I told them I was going to a ladies' Bible study. And to the
Never mind, Ted.
feedback.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And there's a food bank at this church.
Mm-hmm.
And his comment back to me is, well, I don't know about, and I said to him, and do you have a home church?
Mm-hmm.
And his comment back to me is he's a survivor from Children's Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and he's putting all his good works back at Children's Hospital into the cancer society down there and cancer camps and so forth. Now you have 30 seconds to respond to
If
this.
you're lucky.
So what you're going to say, because the bus transportation guy is backing me out of the van.
Yeah. Awesome.
And I just look at him and I'm thinking, Lord, I need a comment.
A rejoinder.
Yeah,
You need a rebuttal.
I do. And so I said to him, well, I'm sure you have chaplains at Children's Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
No, there's just this society. I said, well, in your group there is. But I said, I know there are chaplains available to you. And he said, well, at the camp we have chaplains. And I said, yes. I said, and you have a question about God. You told me that. I said, can you talk to your chaplain about that? And with that, I'm gone. And it's in the Lord's hands.
Well, so
But what should I have said?
You can't change people's mind. You're not here because your mind told you to be here. You're here because the Holy Spirit called us to be here.
Yeah.
And so that's the start answer. The start here is that you don't change people's minds, right? That's God's work.
Right.
That God is the judge. God is the sender of the Holy Spirit. God is the one who works on people's hearts over the course of their lives, and you shouldn't take God's job from God. So start there. Now I'm going to give you a big old but. That we are part of who God claims, and therefore participate in the work God is doing.
God has called us to stand in the gap.
So you don't do it. So you can't is what Jackie said, which I said I'd put a note in. You're talking about 30 seconds while you're having to focus on, do I have my stuff? Where am I headed? Am I on here right? Like, you have other things going on besides saving lost souls at the moment. What you can do is be who God called you to be for that moment. And you don't do it, God does it.
Right.
And what we believe that we're doing is this is a kind of not human thing, but we're all part of God's plan. I'll call us a sort of cog in the way God is at work. So that the full responsibility of whether that person goes to see a chaplain or whatever is not yours.
Right.
But your sharing what the gospel is your job. And then once you've done it, it's kind of God has to work over the totality of who they are. I'm going to tell you that I think Qoheleth is about how you do this. And that's what I'm talking. Now I'm sending around another piece of paper. And I know it's a lot of paper. And I know I'm covering this fast and a lot. This is why I'm going to do it for 2 weeks. I'm going to say the same thing 2 weeks in a row so you can kind of work through it. I'm going to send around. There's enough. They'll go all the way around. I'm sending them both ways. If there's any extra piece, just set it in the middle and we'll keep them in here. Emily, again, I'll look at these again next week. The one that I'm currently sending around is the textbook for our Intro to New Testament class. So it's old. The book is by Albert Bell, and it's called Exploring the New Testament. It's just one sheet, double-sided. What I do so that I'm quoting a place is I give you the title page of the book, so that if you ever... I'm giving you the title page of the book on one side, so you can find... This is the information you would need to the book is the most shoddily put together book I have ever owned. I own hundreds and I own 1,000 books. It is the most shoddy book I have ever owned. It looks like the whole thing has been put together on an old mimeograph machine. It is appearance-wise the shoddiest book I have. Content-wise, it is invaluable. So the back has a little bit for you. It has one small section that I'm going to talk to you about from it's a chapter called The Judaic Background of the New Testament. So remember that the early Christians are Jewish. They're from Jewish history. This is from page 34. This chapter was like 20 pages long, or I would have run off the whole chapter. I just got lazy and cheap. The book I will gladly. You could probably get it at Amazon for $1. I'm going to read 2 of these chapters or paragraphs. From 3 paragraphs I'm going to read, starting on page 34 on the back, and I'm just going to directly read them because I'm going to try to establish a connection between the scribes and who Qoheleth is pretending to be. The Gospels, this is the second full paragraph down, so it's about a fourth of the way down the page. The Gospels often speak of scribes and Pharisees as though the two were separate groups. This may not have been the case. The confusion possibly arose out of difficulties in translating caused by changes in the meaning of the words. So what that's starting to tell you is, you don't go from grandma's cooking, I'm an Italian guy who eats at grandma's house, to let's go get Indian food tonight. You don't change from that overnight. It's a big thing that happened. This is a slow process. The Bible did not become canon all at once. The diaspora did not get spread out and influence. The history of all this is long, and it doesn't happen overnight. And the words lose their ability to be translated. It's a long thing. But here's the part I wanted to start to get into. A class of scribes, Sopharim, singular Sophar, had existed in Judaism probably since the time of Ezra. So Ezra is a book in the Hebrew Bible that has to do with the return of people to their land. In the list of Ezra has lists of people. I wrote this down. In the second chapter of Ezra, there are lists of people who keep the word. They have masculine names with feminine endings. This only happens in Ezra, in Nehemiah, and Qoheleth. They're the only names in the whole of the Bible that use, it's like Spanish. They have feminine words and masculine words. We don't have that so much in English. There are only 3 or 4 names in the whole Bible that have a feminine name with a little masculine added piece on the back. They're found in Ezra, They're found in Nehemiah, and then Qoheleth is that word. Qoheleth is a feminine word with a little masculine end tacked on the back. Qoheleth says that he was a king. I was a king of Israel. Do you know the kings? You've been taught all this in Sunday school. When did Qoheleth reign? Saul, David, Solomon. You know all those. Qoheleth is not a name of a king that ever reigned.
Right.
But he says in the very first, in Ecclesiastes 1:1, I'm Qoheleth, I'm a king. He's telling you, he's not what he's saying he is.
He calls himself the teacher.
The word Qoheleth, I'll look it up. The word Qoheleth means teacher. I always have to look it up in the front here. 986. I'll read it. The word Qoheleth means teacher. The words of the teacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. He's not a son of David. He's never a king. He's not a son of David. He's deliberately pretending to be somebody else. And who he's pretending to be is in that tradition of Ezra. He's named himself the same way they named themselves, and it's very distinct, a feminine name with a little masculine ending. He's pretending to be a very early rendition of what became the scribes. The people that by the time Jesus comes aren't the good guys. So I'm back on this piece of paper. The class of scribes had existed in Judaism probably since the time of Ezra, who led the people of Israel back to a strict observance of the law after their return from Babylonian exile. The danger of the exile was not that their country was taken over. The danger of the exile was many of their people are now exposed to Babylonian belief. They're now, like in the words that I'm talking about with my grandma is 100% Italian. By the time I am no longer 100% Italian. It's that old problem of find a nice Catholic Italian girl, John. But when you live in America, the people you're exposed to and the people you meet are not always nice Italian Catholic. When you lived in Italy and everybody lived in the same town, maybe that was possible. But here it isn't. When the Jewish people went into exile, the word paradise entered their lexicon. By the way, that word is in Ecclesiastes. That's the first place in the Old Testament. He's using Babylonian words for faith instead of just Jewish ones. That's a problem, because they might or might not know what Yahweh wants. You understand you can follow that. Scribes were copyists of the law and regarded themselves as its preservers and protectors rather than inspired interpreters. Their whole job is not to write something new, it's to protect the thing that's already been written. One Talmudic tractate urges the sofer, the scribe, to be deliberate in giving judgment and train many disciples and make a fence around the law. And does anybody know what that means, LXX?
That's the Septuagint.
That's the Septuagint. That's the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. It's very old, but it's taking the Hebrew Bible out of Hebrew and putting it into Greek. Do you know why it has to be into Greek? Because Jewish people are now spread out all over the place, and some of them don't even really know the Hebrew that well, but they can speak this, so they have to start. It's that diaspora problem. When the Septuagint was translated, the Greek word grammatias, scribe, was used for Hebrew sofer, and the meaning was clear. Now here's where we're going to start getting into why this applies. I'm attaching all this to Ecclesiastes. I'm going to give you the punchline. We're going to talk about it, then I'm going to do it again next week because it's a lot to hear. By the late 2nd century BC, the Hebrew shofar had taken on a new meaning. seen in the apocryphal book of Ben Sirach, or what's the name of it? Ecclesiastes, which says that the scribe seeks out the wisdom of all the ancients. So now the scribe can not just defend the law, but can start to talk about New Age, or talk about what the Babylonians believe, or he will show the wisdom of what he has learned and will glory in the law of the Lord's covenant. Sirach is a book that is in extra books of the Bible, but is not in our canon, and it cites it here. By that time, I can go on and on there, but you sort of see the connection. I believe that the teacher, that the person who wrote this book, is very late and is one of the last sort of parts of the Old Testament to be written, and is certainly one of the last ones to be put in. And that he's concerned about how to be faithful in a world with so many distractions. How do you marry a good Roman Catholic Italian girl in a world where there's so many other people you're going to meet? And we've seen that play out in things like you can't marry people of other races, or you can't, and people fall in love with people who they fall in love with. But how do you keep your identity? How do you live in a world with how do you convince people of the path of faith in the midst of a world where they can be good by just volunteering at the hospital? Being good is not what saves you, by the way. So as soon as they face some really drastic thing, their ability to volunteer at the hospital is not going to save them. They need Jesus who loves them, who shows them what salvation is. How do you speak to people in all this? This is, it's on my mind because it's this Sunday's gospel. And again, I know this is a lot, and I want to leave you some time to talk to me. So I'm going to do this again next week, because I'm not really laying all my cards out here. It's a lot to hear. This is this week's gospel. It's from the 9th chapter of Mark. And it's verses, our reading is from 38 to 50, but I want to read just a few of them. If any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, so if any of you mislead somebody if any of you mislead someone who believes in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life maimed than to have 2 hands and to go to hell, to the unquenchable fire. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life lame than to have 2 feet and to be thrown into hell. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It is better for you to enter the kingdom of God with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into hell. How do we interpret those verses? Now, besides all the points I'm making with Ecclesiastes, those verses from Mark that say if we ever mislead someone, we should tie a millstone around our neck and jump into the sea. Or if we ever sin, we should cut off the thing that sinned. How do we handle those verses? What do we do with them? You preach a mini sermon to me on that text.
Well, that's hyperbole.
Nobody is cutting off their hand. And you would stop coming here if I had an axe and was like, everybody come up today and we're chopping off fingers, hands, noses, eyes. How do you know it's hyperbole? How do you know it?
Because we're all sinners, and we're all gonna stumble, and we're all gonna, so what are we all supposed to?
Well, if you're a scribe with the Bible, you should follow this perfectly.
Well, yeah, that's the whole idea, that's the sarcasm.
You know that it's hyperbole. You know that it's hyperbole, and you know that it's sarcasm.
Yeah.
How do you know? When the author of Ecclesiastes says, I'm a scribe and I'm wise and I'm one of you, and everything that we can think of and all of our wisdom and all of our work is vapor, is that true? Is all of our work vapor? He knows that it's not vapor. It's 100% hyperbole. Because when you're sitting in a world of people who think they already know what you're going to say about church, you've got to come up with another way to say it. And Ecclesiastes is a person who is in a system that sees the growing power of the scribes and Pharisees, who doesn't necessarily believe in what they teach and what they say, but doesn't know how to fix it. And so he poses as one and makes what they say, blows it way out of proportion, so that you're like, well, this is crazy. Is it true that everything we do is vapor? Why get out of bed if everything we do is vapor? Vanity of vanities, why bother fixing your house? Vanity of vanities, why bother make cookies? Vanity of vanities, why go back and get tests for how your health is doing? Why do it?
Well, see, there's a couple ways of looking at it.
Yeah.
Because in a way, you are here but a very short time. And in your mind, you can think.
Well, it's not wrong. It's not wrong.
But the gift of life has been given to you as well, which is to be honored and respected every day, because that was a gift from God. So you are required to live, because that's the gift.
If you're interacting with people who, you're trying to talk to and you have 30 seconds, and who are so sure of their path, but who you believe that path is not going to be the ultimate solution to the depth of life and to eternity, how do you talk to them? You can't say this in 30 seconds, so this is kind of blown out of proportion. But, if you were really a good person, you would spend more time volunteering at the hospital. You only volunteer 10 hours a week, you should do more.
No, that's not the answer.
But it's hyperbole that is different than what, if I say to them, I think you need Jesus, I don't think they're going to hear that. Your works don't save you, Jesus does. Your volunteering at the hospital does not save you, Jesus does. So instead, I'm going to say, I think that you should spend more time. That's all you're doing? You should do more.
Or how do you know how much is enough?
Yeah, so those are different angle, and you don't have to answer it. You're just dropping the question to hope, because you're just going to, how do you know when you've done enough at the hospital, sir, to solve the world's problems? All right, thanks for the drop off. And then you're kind of hoping that while he's driving down the road, he'll be like, yeah, well, how can I do enough? You can't. God does enough. The book of Ecclesiastes does not mention God because it wants you to find it. And it's trying to pose as
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, but not
much.
Yeah, it almost didn't get in the Bible because of how little it teaches us about who God is. It talks about who humans are. And it's really tongue-in-cheek. For me, we've lost the tongue-in-cheek part of Ecclesiastes, and now everybody takes it seriously, and we've forgotten that it's hyperbole, and it would be the same as taking the chop off your hands seriously. I do not believe that everything is vapor. I do not believe that at all. I do not know the difference between vapor and meaning, but I believe God can use any of it for God to work in my life or in someone else's life. And then it's meaningful, not meaningless. We've lost the playfulness of Ecclesiastes, and I would say we've lost the playfulness of how to interact with people. We take their salvation so seriously that we think in 30 seconds we have to save them. It's God who saves them. We're not going to be able to do it. I think the reason why they become so rigid and not listening is because they're so used to the rigid scribe answer they're going to get. So I give them a different one. If any of that makes sense. I'm not sure I'm giving them the right answer, but I don't want to give them the one I know doesn't work. I'm going to talk more about this exact same thing next week. I'm going to do the exact same stuff. Because I think, the whole reason why I wanted to study Ecclesiastes with you all is because I think it asks you to interact in the world differently. Me and us. I think it asks us to believe God is at work, and when you see things that aren't right, there's a way to enter into that. Now, I'm leaving you minus 4 minutes to talk about it. So if you have questions, make sure you write them down, and we'll start next time by talking about what you heard. Is that fair? Because I'm leaving you no time to talk about it. If we believe our world's broken, I do not believe we can just try harder and fix it. I think we need to try different. If we believe that our world is not aware enough of who God is, I don't believe we can scream louder and fix it. I think we have to feel ourselves called into saying something new and different. And that God calls us as God's people to use our imaginations. How do we know that's hyperbole?
So you think I should have left a question in his mind for him searching? In other words, how do you know when you've done enough?
Yeah, so
could have been a response.
I don't know. I guess what I'm getting at is I'm not you, so I'm not judging you.
No, I realize that.
But I'm not in that situation. But I think that person he already knows that by dropping you off at church that you're going to give the church answer. So give him the answer that's still the church answer, but not the one he thought he was going to get. Does that make sense? Like, hyperbole is not the answer you expect. You do not expect Jesus to be in here and say, hey, I love you, but if you're sinful today, cut off your arm.
Right.
And we all know not to listen to it. Nobody does it. Why does Jesus bother to say it? Mm-hmm. To get you to think about how sinfulness and how extreme it is.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, the first thing we showed him was that he was going to church on a Thursday morning.
And you interacted with him.
Yes.
It's not like you were like,
the food bank.
it's not like you were like, shut up, I'm busy. I mean, you talked to him, you were loving. I think you did a lot.
Him about having chaplains at this hospital. I can't imagine that there would be anybody that was in the hospital that used their services, which is what he said. He was recovering, right? Or he had recovered?
He survived entirely because of the hospital.
I cannot believe he did not know there was a chapel in there.
I don't believe that he survived because of the hospital. This is the difference between him and I.
Well, they visit you. I know when I was. Time I went to the hospital. Hi, I'm so and so.
He didn't believe we don't survive because of the hospital. I'm not saying the hospital's bad. I'm not saying I would go to a hospital right now if I needed it. That's not what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
That's not why we survive.
Right.
We survive and we are given life through God himself.
Absolutely.
No, and we're trying to proclaim that. God gives gifts to people over a long period of time which have advanced our hospitals to all sorts of great places, but that's not what saved it.
But somewhere along the line, he's not accepting that.
And you're not going to fix that.
He's just not ready yet.
So by admitting that you're not going to fix it, it frees you to just not have all the pressure of saying the right thing that fixes it. And when you don't have to say the right thing that fixes it, you can say almost anything.
Yeah.
You can be like our grandkids, my kids expect me to say, there's a Bible verse about that.
I could have come up with something about alligators and crocodiles.
Well, this is a lot to talk about because irony, sarcasm, hyperbole are difficult to wrap your mind around.
I have 4 minutes to go back.
Yep. So I'm gonna close with a quick prayer, but I'm gonna do this again because it's all hard to hear, right? It's hard to think about. Pray about it for a whole week. Come with questions. You have some reading material. We'll talk about it more, okay? So let us pray. Gracious God, we ask that you would remind us that we do not save ourselves, that you love us, and that your love in Christ is what saves us, that you are what we need. We ask that you would use our gifts and you would free us to be part of your love and your care of others being spread. We ask that you would guide us and keep us in our families and in our neighborhoods for the rest of the day. And we ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.